Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the monastery, the open bar of the internet, the world's greatest shit show, and the place where we, the good brothers and sisters of this most holy of temples, seek enlightenment through the drunkest, craziest, and most batshit ways possible. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me I have a returning good brother to the temple, coming to us from the weird and wonderful world of Discami. Previously, here when it came to the retro Big Eye Small Mouth, now coming back to the kickstarting fray with a expansion to Anime 5e known as Beyonder Worlds, as well as further expansions when it comes to the monster entries. The one and only Mark MacKinnon. How you doing today, man?
It's great. Thank you very much for having me on again. It's good to be here.
Thank you for coming on. I enjoy having you on. So, It's been a hot minute since I brought you on to talk about Anime 5e. As mentioned, the last project that you had gone through was the retro edition of Big Eye Small Mouth, thanks to events around that time.
Right.
As well as a bit of things like Icarus and some of the 4E expansions.
Mm-hmm.
Now, with this one, you're coming back with 3 projects we'll be getting into. Monstrum Libri, a new set of creature cards, and Beyonder Worlds.
That's right.
Now, would it be first off, with Beyonder Worlds, I distinctly recall you hinted at this when I had you on to talk about Folstavia.
Yes.
Was Beyonder Worlds basically meant to be the Anime 5e's equivalent to the multiverse concepts you already had in BESM 4e?
Certainly similar to that. What it's more intended to do is kind of close the loop on the aspects that weren't included with Anime 5e compared to our BESM 4th edition line. So our multi-genre universal game, BESM, is intended to handle kind of any genre, any setting, any time period. But when we did Anime 5e, of course, because it's built upon the 5th edition system, we wanted to make sure that it focused on fantasy. When we did, stepping back 20 years, when we did BESM D20, we did a D20 adaptation of BESM. We did it with every genre. But this time with Anime 5e, we wanted to focus on what made D&D special, which was fantasy. But we knew that, of course, our fans some of them want to do more. And what if you want to have a fantasy world, but bring in some aliens, bring in, some different aspects, or start crossing between different genres? And there'll be some purists that, the D&D fans that want to play Anime 5e like a traditional fantasy game, no problem. They can continue with Anime 5e. But we thought if people wanted something that offers a little bit different, maybe a couple of abilities that are more science fiction oriented, or more mecha, or totally break out of the mold and go to Earth and do some things on Earth, that's where Beyonder Worlds come in. So while it does play into a multiverse type setting that we have similar to our Big Eye Small Mouth, and so Folstavia being our primary high fantasy and different types of fantasy setting for Anime 5e, the Beyonder Worlds, whether it's a cyberpunk world or a science fiction world, they all interplay in with Folstavia, given that Folstavia has been kind of put aside a bit of an apocryphal universe because of the problems going on with what we call the Nox. They're like the let's just say that the evil darkness that goes on. So with the Folstavia, the powers that be kind of shoved it in its own little pocket area, but we still have other worlds, which is where the Beyonder Worlds expansion ties in.
And actually, that genre mixing is, oddly enough, very anime.
Oh yeah.
It's something that I had hinted at in that review of Anime 5e I did a while back, in that you look at a lot of, say, fantasy anime, and they're not exactly doing the high medieval approach that a lot of people might expect. Like you look back at Slayers, you see plenty of modern anachronisms. You look back at even though something like Record of Lodoss War has its roots in D&D, the way that world has evolved is not as compatible as one might think. You know, just to use those two as examples. I mean, yes, Lodoss started out as a bunch of D&D replays, but even back then, the world of Lodoss barely resembles a typical D&D world, even though it almost was one.
Right.
It almost was one, but TSR didn't know how to play ball. Then again, this was the mid-'80s, so it would have been right around the time Lorraine Williams was running things.
Yep.
And I don't think I need to go into detail why a lot of people don't like her.
And we know that, of course, the gamers are incredibly imaginative. And so, as you said, you may be doing fantasy, but you want to blend in other elements that are non-fantasy style elements, very anime. And that's where we figure Beyonder Worlds has a place to give that creativity to the players.
I mean, hell, did it? A lot of the people who were like, no science fiction, none of that stuff in my fantasy. I'm like, you have a copy of Expedition to the Barrier Peaks. You know, it's not like Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft weren't swapping notes all the time back in the day. Like, it's something I've had some back and forth with, that a lot of the pulp writers were not as hardline on the fantasy end of things as some people think. I think it's one of those Mandela effect kind of things. You know, like when the Schumacher Batman films came around, and this narrative that Batman was always serious until he screwed it up started showing up. Let's just conveniently forget all the cocaine train that was the Silver Age.
Yeah.
Because I've said it before, I'll say it again. I refuse to believe anyone was sober during some of those comics. But even with that, now I know that there's going to be a few new classes in Anime 5e. You had it where you were presenting the formula for how each of the classes was made and the point total for them. Is that still going to be the thing for the new classes?
Yeah, absolutely. We're using our 200 points over 20 levels as kind of the baseline, so we can ensure that every class is going to be balanced in totality. In the end of, in individual levels may be a little off, where class A at level 7 might be slightly more powerful than class B at level 7, but over the 20 levels in total, we wanted to make sure everything balanced out, and 200 points is kind of our benchmark. And so all of the 7 new the 10 new classes that we have in Beyonder Worlds are all balanced with that in mind.
Now, this is where we get into one particular thing that fantasy has had a rocky relationship with, since one of the classes you have is Esper, and you should know as well as anyone else, the way psychics have been used over the years in D&D has been a series of peaks and valleys, a lot more valleys than peaks. You had the early days where they were either completely useless or completely OP, or some more recent cases where they were just spellcasters in a different coat of paint.
Right.
With the Esper, is that more using the dynamic power setup, or is it using a full-on casting system?
Yeah, so with the Espers class, we decided not to go the dynamic powers route. So in the base game, our benders or our dynamic spellbinders use the dynamic power system, where the psionicists, they use a spell system. But with the Espers, what we're doing is actually giving discrete abilities, and so it's whether it's a force shield, so kind of like a mental force field, or mind shield, telepathy, telekinesis, cognition. So these are the things that we're giving specific attributes to the Espers. So it's not as dynamic as someone who might be a psionicist using spell slots, or someone who might be a bender, but a mind bender, or it might be more appropriate if you're going to be a mind bender. Maybe that's a little bit more powerful and should be a dynamic spellbinder who specializes in the mind. What the Espers are, there's discrete attributes that they focus on, and so we've removed the dynamic aspect that's already in the core book.
Mm-hmm. And given that you already have a Scion, if someone were to approach asking what the difference is between a Scion and an Esper, what would you tell them?
So the big thing is the flexibility. So the psionicist, while they have more breadth in terms of, because they're spell slots, and so they are more fixed on the different spells that they have. And if someone wants to be almost like a mental wizard, because the spells are inherently D&D, the core 5th edition. And while we don't particularly use spells to a great deal, we know that there's a lot of D&D play that like the confines of spells. And so if you want to be a mental wizard, if you want to cast mental spells, that's what the psionicist is for. But someone who's not a psionicist doesn't have the incredible breadth of skills, but they can move things with their mind. They can talk to people telepathically. They can erect mental force fields and mind shields. All of those are more focused on the Esper. That's not to say they don't have access to dynamic powers. We do provide 4 levels, over 20 levels. They have 4 ranks in dynamic powers, but that's not where their focus is, like a dynamic spellbinder, or of course not like the spell slots that the psionicist have. So it's more of a particular form, an expression of how we see the Espers in this particular world that we have set up.
Mm-hmm. I can certainly get that. Now, with that said, one of the other classes you had in the table of contents in that preview was the Explorer, and you already the core already has the Adventurer. So I'm curious where the two divert from each other, because I could see the Explorer kind of filling in that jack of many trades approach.
And certainly, I mean, in the end, a term is a term, and we call them adventurers and explorers. They obviously seem very similar in that sense. And there are some similarities with the adventurer from the core book. They have unrestricted free points, and so all we do is we just give them points, and then they go off and spend it the way they want to. But because they have all these unrestricted points, they suffer a little penalty for that kind of breadth of abilities. So they're only at 190 points, like a 5% penalty, as opposed to 200 points. With the Explorer, they have the full 200, but they still do have a good number of free points to spend. But then we give them a bunch of attributes that we think is quite appropriate for how we portray someone who's an explorer, someone that's going to be visiting undiscovered places, someone who is looking for mysteries. You can think of an explorer in many ways as like Guardians of the Galaxy. That Star Lord is an explorer, although of course superhero world, so it doesn't quite be the same. But things like they're going to have a lot more languages. They're going to have ways of giving advantages, dice roll advantages in more situations. Of course, they're going to have a lot of combat techniques, and they're also going to be able to be unaffected by other people's abilities that they have. So there'll be some effects that other people can use typically that they're not going to affect the explorer. So it's not quite a jack of all trades. It's more like you're halfway there. So you have some specialized abilities, but then still a good number of flexibility points that you can spend to kind of customize the person to be what you want to be.
Mm-hmm. Now,
And in the end, what a lot of the we're doing, and just to expand on that a little bit, is we're really showing different ways that people can do builds. Because unlike core 5th edition, it's very difficult to build a class. How do you build a new D&D class? It's not easy to do. In terms of playtesting and making sure that it's balanced. And is this subclass balanced versus the wizard subclasses? But the advantage with the point-based system is we're showing through all these different classes we have, here's different ways you can build something up to create a character that's going to be balanced with other characters, but at the same time offers you flexibility and creativity to be the character that you want to play.
Mm-hmm. Now, in each of the chapters that you are focusing on a different world and a different genre,
Right.
and with that in mind, given the associated worlds that you have with each, I would like to kind of dip into that, and what sort of media served as inspiration for that. And the first one I want to start with is the Soul Star Pact in the science fiction chapter for the book.
Right. So you're looking at kind of what the Soul Star Pack, kind of what it did, or what kind of effect that it had.
What sort of science fiction that's going to be emphasizing, because science fiction is a very wide net, obviously.
Oh, I see. Yes. Okay. I see what you're saying. Yeah, in the end, because I didn't rate the creative aspects of the world, so I'm more the system guy, is what I am. But Robin Flanagan, who's our creative director, he's very well read, is much more creative in these aspects than I am. I'm more of a numbers guy, and so I can't speak exactly every single kind of genre aspect that he's looking at, but a lot of the classics. So it's not even just looking at anime. For inspiration, there will be, obviously we want to make sure this feels like an anime science fiction genre, or an anime mecha fantasy genre, or urban fantasy. But at the same time, we're going to be looking outside that, whether it's novels, comics, even popular movies, other role-playing games. And so the Soul Star Pack is, that overarching kind of galactic negotiations that you're going to have between major powers in order to get together to agree to something. And that's, we hint about what's happened with the Soul Star stuff in some of the Folstavia as well, but we expand on it, and specifically how it applies to the science fiction world. But I mean, I'd hate to kind of go off and talk about all the inspirations when it's really Robin that would be the best one to answer a question like that.
I can get that. So to pivot instead, it does look like each. If I'm misreading this, feel free to correct me. But it looks like each chapter is going to have a class that leans a bit into that particular storytelling genre, like the gadgeteer in the case of science fiction.
That's exactly it. We wanted to make sure that we offered a selection of classes that are kind of overarching for everything, but then in each of the individual genres we have for one additional class. That's not to say you're stuck with that. It's like, well, I'm running a fantasy game, so I can't use the gadgeteer who's from a science fiction world. No, we just wanted to present something that was more aligned with the type of things you'd see in science fiction. But we obviously know there are fantasy gadgeteers as well, and there's probably urban fantasy gadgeteers and mecha fantasy gadgeteers. That would all play out, but we thought it was best to put it in that chapter to show people kind of that we have classes that are intended for a wide distribution, and then classes more specific to that implementation of the genre that we're showing.
Yeah. I know there's a lot of arguments about the Artificer in various editions, but I've always been of the mindset I don't hate the idea. I've never had an issue with the idea, and I think it does have a place in fantasy. I think the problem that I always had with a lot of artificers in more ubiquitous fantasy games is this playing half-seas regarding magic.
Oh, yeah.
I feel like the somebody who's described as the artificer, the gadgeteer, or whatnot, should not be doing some half casting stuff. It should, or if they do any sort of casting, it's less about I throw fireball and more about I made a device that throws fireballs.
Right, yes.
They don't cast burning
Yeah,
hands.
that's true.
They build a flamethrower.
And with the Gadgeteer in particular, you're going to get into problems, and same with magical crafters. It's, in a typical D&D game, it's like, well, if you have someone that can make powerful stuff, why don't they just make powerful stuff and sell it? Or make powerful stuff and give it to everyone in the group. And suddenly you have everyone walk around with, +5 plate mail, +5 swords, guns. It does make it difficult, and you can try to bring up some sort of artificial limitations like money or time or something like that. But in a role-playing game, sometimes you just have to lean into the genre convention and say, well, you're going to be playing an adventurer. You're not playing a character who's working in a lab all the time, because they're not adventurers. And Gadgeteer certainly plays into that. Just leading a little bit about when you mentioned the science fiction chapter and you talked about the Soul Star Pack and the Gadgeteer. So what we might to do with each of the chapters of genres is it's a combination of setting, game mechanics, and genre conventions, and each chapter has all three components of there. So we talk about what is it like to run a science fiction game, and what are some of the things you have to do to make it anime science fiction, as well as providing some the different types of gear, equipment, the classes, talk about the different races, show some specific monster types that would be aligned with those different chapters. And we decided to divide it up with 5 separate settings, with 5 separate chapters, 5 separate genres, and go into all of those aspects. And that leads back to my design philosophy all the way back to Bessa when we're doing first and second edition. Is I think books should be game material, but also genre material. If you're trying to give people the tools to run and play in a particular genre, it can't just all be about numbers or setting. You have to talk about the genre itself.
Mm-hmm. And in that same vein, when it comes to mecha fantasy, I said before, science fiction can be a wide net. The same can very much be applicable with mecha. Just dealing with size and design motifs of different mecha can be very, very wide. You could have shorter borderline power armor style mechs a la Votoms, or you could have the giant ship mechs in say Robotech or / Macross.
Yeah, absolutely. And with, we call the chapter Mecha Fantasy, and part of that is to, yes, to tie into the 5th edition, but also to kind of demonstrate that, people that say mecha science fiction, the problem with in a lot of it is that term fiction. We think inherently mecha is an aspect of fantasy. They're just these gigantic 60-foot towering walking robots. That doesn't make any sense. From a science point of view, it's an illogical way of doing it, even when you're placing them in a more science fiction setting, like say Evangelion or as you said, Votoms. But we think that mecha fantasy really applies more to a broader look at fantasy being fantastical when you're bringing in mecha. That way you can get the aspects that are a little bit more on the spaceship science fiction-y sides, but also on the sides where you have, say, Vision of Escaflowne and people who are going to be more fantasy mecha.
Mm-hmm. I've talked about it elsewhere, but the concept of fantasy in mecha is one that I find significantly underrated. Because when it comes to the major entries that are trying to do mecha in a fantasy setting, it's stuff like Vision of Escaflowne, maybe 5-star stories, but there's an argument that can be made either way on that, and Aura Battler Dunbine, which, as much as I enjoy it, that's also a Tamino work, so everyone dies.
Right. Yeah, and Code Geass is, if you're looking at something a little more modern, certainly also plays in with some of the politics that, no, I wouldn't say full on fantasy, but certainly more fantasy style elements than say something that's more hard science fiction like a Gundam.
But something that I think anyone has to account for if they're trying to lean into anime for their tabletop, whether it be through Anime 5e or anything, honestly, is that genre is played a bit more fast and loose with anime across different genres and subgenres, which is a bit of a contrast from the hardline approach that some take when it comes to genres.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. That mecha almost calls to it being more diverse. You have the hard edge type mecha, but even D&D. Think of steampunk fantasy with the dwarves creating their giant clockwork golem. I mean, that's mecha oriented, right? If you put a dwarf inside a clockwork golem, and so yeah, it does have a very broad appeal of mechas from the science. I guess you can't go too hard with science fiction with mecha because a lot of it doesn't make sense. It's not the most effective scientific form for a fighting style, but giant fighting robots when you're piloting them is certainly. I mean, that's core anime right there.
Yeah, and I do remember experimenting that a little bit with that when I looked back and considered the kind of maintenance and the effect that a knight's armor can have, and I thought, well, given how you have that concept with a medieval knight, why not jump the timeline a few centuries and have power armor be treated the same way a knight's armor was?
Oh yeah, that's a good way to look at it. And with the mecha fantasy chapter, one of the things that we lean on is the Sentai aspect of there. So mecha fantasy, certain where you have. Yeah, the Power Rangers is kind of the best example. A bunch of people in suits that are going to team up and make a giant mecha from a bunch of small little mecha, and whether it's Power Rangers or Voltron, when you're going to be combining it, it's not exclusively like that. And when we did Besem D20 way back 20 years ago, the Sentai class was very much heavily around. You get advantages when there's other people who are also part of the Sentai class nearby. And that was one of the things that we inherently set up as a group dynamic, that you need your teammates. With the Sentai Ranger this time, we decided to forego that tie-in to give a little bit more individuality, so that someone wanted to play, well, I'm one Sentai Ranger, and of course Sentai being more team-oriented, but no, they're going to be part of an adventuring group, whether it's science fiction or fantasy, but they have their armor, they might have that helmet, they might have a sword, and they might have a mecha that transforms, all of the genre conventions, but they're solo. They're not part of a group of other people like them. They're part of the adventuring group of the people who aren't like them. And that was something we thought was important, because tying the Sentai Ranger and to say, well, you can't play one year on your own. All your other player characters all have to be Sentai Rangers as well, or it doesn't make sense. We didn't want to have that restriction in there, so we made it a little bit more broad this time.
And speaking as somebody who's a longtime fan of tokusatsu, that's a smart move, since a lot of people will undoubtedly use the Sentai Ranger class, and I know this because I saw it happen with my own two eyes, as a lead-in for other subgenres within tokusatsu. In particular, stuff like Kamen Rider, which is
right
on a similar vein in a lot of ways, but is definitely not as team centric. And
right.
Some people have tried to force one into the other, and it doesn't quite work. And of course, there's the Sixth Ranger effect that's been a thing ever since Zyu Ranger, which was used for the original Power Rangers. And of course, the funny thing about that is Toei didn't have any faith in the idea of a Sixth Ranger, to the point that they didn't put Burai in the opening credits for that.
Oh,
which is a case of hindsight being 2020. Because it was so for something that was supposed to be a short-lived thing, it was so successful that it became standard to do ever since.
Right.
Uh,
Well, even someone like Ultraman, doesn't quite fit into the exact structure that it's not Power Rangers, Ultraman, but it certainly has enough elements that we think that would play out well with the Sentai Ranger class.
Yeah, and I've also brought up Garo in the past, which is adjacent to this kind of thing, but is far more horror themed.
Right.
In fact, has a lot of veterans of like 90s tokusatsu working on it when it comes to monster designs and the like.
Right.
But approaching that in that team-based affair doesn't quite work. And in the case of both Ultraman and Garo, there's going to be some questions you're going to have to ask, because both of those types of heroes have some sort of time limit restriction. Ultraman has the color timer, which is usually about 3 minutes, and Garo, with the armor, has a rule of 99.9 seconds.
Well, even the old Battle of the Planets, the Gatchaman. I mean, certainly it fits into that. And if someone's like, "Oh, I want to play Mark from G-Force, but I just want to play Mark. No one else is part of the crew." Yeah, sure. We have a class that can allow you to do that now.
And of course, on the mecha side of things, there's been that half in, half out divide between super robot and real robot. Although the divide is not as divisive as people sometimes think it is.
Right.
I mean, that you see a lot of people talk about Gundam as if it leans into the real robot category, but it's using a lot of the same camera techniques that Super Robot uses, including the infamous Obari pose, also known as Brave Perspective, which, even if you've never seen the name Obari pose, I guarantee you have seen the Obari pose, because it is everywhere.
Oh yeah, with the giant sword, yeah.
Sometimes it's not a giant sword, but just that perspective setup.
Perspective, yeah.
The official name is Brave Perspective because you use it a lot for the Brave series, but
Right.
nobody calls it that. They all call it the Obari pose. And there's one infamous image that I've shared, and I'll share this with you, this just to show how ubiquitous this thing is. Like that's just a collection of it showing up in different anime.
Right.
It's right up there with things like, say, the Itano Circus, which is the nickname for that missile spam that you see a lot in Robotech and similar anime. Of just
Right, yeah.
A bunch of missiles. That's gotten the nickname of the Itano Circus. And speaking of that, that's a good question. That's a good lead-in. With some, there's always been a kind of downstream effect of fighter pilot movies, a la Top Gun and the like, with mecha. So within the framework of Anime 5e, if someone wanted to do dogfighting, ships chasing each other in that sense, how would you handle it within that framework? How would you advise someone handle it within that framework?
Yeah, I mean, because Anime 5e, and certainly 5th edition, as its core, isn't simulationist in that way. I look at what we did with Anime 5e in particular is intended to be more dramatic and less about trying to simulate something exactly. And so the standard rules that we have with auto fire, which I know it's not as much of a D&D thing, but we have auto fire style rules in Anime 5e. That would, if you have your dogfighters, you could represent them in numerous different ways through, what your weapons do. Or you could do it from a more dramatic way, just describing it. And you can use your standard D20 attack rolls. You can bring in elements, if you wanted to, that enhance armor class with something just beyond dex. Maybe it could be charisma, for example, if you wanted to change things a little bit. I think the flexibility of any game is really up to GMs and players to be creative with it. And if I look at dog fighting, I mean, I don't want to set a rule. I know there's a full-on role-playing game out there that's just about ships that fight each other, and to me, I don't need a mechanism to do that. That's more about the drama of the story, and then the mechanism has to be there to give some sort of parameters to your dice rolls. But I think when I think of a dogfight, a lot of it's just going to be relying on what the standard rules are, but then applying it in a dramatic way to what fits the narrative best.
Mm-hmm. So, shifting into urban fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
With that one, you have the Technomancer.
Yeah.
I immediately thought of the Technomancer that was in Shadowrun. I think 4th edition was where they introduced that. That was basically a hacker who didn't need a deck.
Oh yeah.
With the Technomancer, is it just a case of magic is technology for them, or what sort of angle did you want to go with them?
Yeah, certainly it really is doing that. It's, when I think of, the old adage about, sufficiently advanced technology being indistinguishable from magic. It's kind of where I see the Technomancer fits in. As a longtime Babylon 5 fan, the Techno Mages, I think, is a great example when I'm thinking, it's not anime, but in my head, when someone is doing something that seems like it's magic, but it's just technology to them. And so it's the application of magic-like effects, but it's using technology as the base. Now, we don't have specific rules for the technology. You don't need that. If you have dynamic powers, if you're an airbender and you can bend air, that's great. You're using air to represent magical effects. Well, if you're using technology to represent magical effects, again, you don't need a specific set of rules. What's the difference between someone who's a technology bender and an airbender or a water bender? It's just the expression of how it's going to come out, and that's where the effects based of the aspect of the system rather than the power-based aspect of the system. So when we freed ourselves from spells, then I think you can free your mind to come up with something that matches your genre conventions much more closely. And so certainly the Technomage, the Technomancers are going to be very heavily towards Dynamic Powers Lesser, which is, in the specific magic category, but it's the technology magic category, as well as, having standard things like transmuting is certainly something that is quite powerful for a Technomancer. They can change one thing to another, and that's where we're really playing with the magic and technology space with the Technomancer.
Mm-hmm. And I do see that you have a sidebar planned called Gadgeteer versus Technomancer. I'm guessing that's an extrapolation on where the two of them are similar and where they diverge.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of that. We in that particular sidebar, it talks about the different builds, because if you're just talking to someone about a Technomancer versus Gadgeteer, they seem similar instinctively, but we talk about the very specific builds on how they change things out, and the attributes we gives them different ways of implementing a similar concept, and that sidebar just addresses that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. And now, when it comes to cyberpunk, you have a cyberpunk class. It looks like.
Yeah.
How is that going to work? Is it like a catch-all of different roles that one might see in Shadowrun and Cyberpunk Red or the like?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, cyberpunk. But to call it a cyberpunk, we're kind of leading into the punk aspect of it. Rebellious, which certainly you're fighting the man, if you want to put it in very kind of classic terms. But you're going to be out on the street. You're going to be a little bit tougher, and this is some of the aspects we've given them are things that technological augmentation. So they're going to get a lot of extra actions over their 20 levels. They're going to be running faster. They're going to have upgrades of bio enhancements. So a lot of features, things that lean into maybe when you think of monsters, they have these different features. Well, some of the cyberpunks are going to have these features, even something as simple as infravision / dark vision. That's if you're a human, you don't have that ability, but you suddenly pluck out your eyes and you put in robotic eyes, and boom, now you have something that is traditionally looked at as being an animal type feature, or obviously tied to demi-human races in fantasy, but in a human type setting, a lot of these things, whether it's claws or wings or something else, little features like this, they're going to be great at jumping, and they're going to have special movement abilities and extra proficiencies for skills, and a lot of this is all playing to the technological augmentation that they're going to have, and we don't, because we're leaning into the effects-based aspect rather than the power-based, we're not telling you that, your character at 5th level replaces their legs and now they have a new pair of legs. We say, no, now they can jump really far at 5th level, and you determine what that was, what kind of augmentation of a techno mod that they ended up getting.
Mm-hmm. Now, there is a certain elephant in the room regarding Cyberpunk, and that is the hacking elephant in the room, because a lot of Cyberpunk games have handled it, and it's had a mixed history. A lot of times because somebody is usually designated as the hacker, even if multiple people could theoretically do it. That's just
right.
How people will compose their parties. You're not going to see a fantasy game where two people are playing the same class. I mean, it happens. It's just very rare.
Yes.
It's just very rare. So, because of that, it's not an uncommon thing to have have a hacking system basically turn the game into a duet between the hacker and the GM.
Right.
How would you address that if someone wanted to run Cyberpunk within Anime 5e's framework?
Yeah, and we have a sidebar about net running, where a lot of in fiction, of course, and in anime, you see it a lot, where people kind of jack into their technology, and then it takes on elements of the real world, where suddenly they're standing in a fictional technological world, and maybe they're having duels that it looks like maybe it's a pet monster duel, and maybe it looks like people are casting spells at each other. That's how we're kind of representing the net running, that it's an extrapolation of taking, you're not going to just be dealing with zeros and ones. You're going to be running in the net, and you're going to be hacking, but it's going to be a dramatic narrative situation where you find yourself in those environments. And I think that plays out really well in fiction, whether it's anime or comic books. And I think that is something that we're leaning into there. And obviously, if one person is running, playing a cyberpunk, and they're deciding to hack into systems, we don't want a lot of people going solo. But that's really no different than a thief going off to do their own little escapades because they have thieving skills at Dungeons and Dragons, and so I'm going to be the one that's going to go break into the Baron's mansion and retrieve this because I'm the one that has all those skills for it. You don't want to have a 3-hour solo session like that while everyone else is waiting around for an action. Same thing with this. You're going to want to interacting with it, and typically what you do, if I was a GM, what I'd be doing is probably flashing between the real world and the net world, and so you're going to be dealing with that character, whatever threats they're doing when they're doing their hacking, whether it's they're encountering ice or they're going to be doing some exploring and trying to find something, and then you're going to be flipping to, well, what's the danger, what are the threats outside of the net running that's happening in your hideout, and what's going on there. And I think that's probably the best way to handle something like that, so you're not going to get one person basically playing solo for an extended period of time.
Mm-hmm. So, going further into that, you have the spy in the Modern Earth chapter, and
right.
Spy fiction can take a lot of angles, and this is actually the third time I've talked about spy fiction on this channel in the last 6 weeks. I mean, on one end you have the almost comic book-esque approach that you have with the James Bond movies over the years. On the other hand, you have the more grounded affairs, whether it be 24. Yes, I consider 24 to be spy fiction, or Bourne, or Tom Clancy when it's done properly.
Mm-hmm.
With the spy class, are you having a setup that it could lean into one of those paradigms without too much issue?
Yeah, because it's playing in an Earth setting, we're not giving our spies supernatural abilities. But there will be aspects that, come from a mechanistic point of view, that we're giving them a mechanism that's not magical or not paranormal. It's represented that is through dice rolls, right? So say like when we have an attribute called edge, which really provides advantages on dice rolls. And so they're going to be choosing which, as they progress, they're going to get better and better, and they're going to start getting advantages on different aspects of what they're doing. And you could say, well, in a fantasy world, the reason why I have an advantage on all of my stealth skills is because I have a paranormal stealth ability. Or you can say the reason why I can do it in a modern Earth setting is because I'm just really talented at sneaking around. And it's just the application of a rule set. So with the spies, they're going to have elements that increase their AC. They're going to be connected to different organizations. They have these dice roll edges and also force disadvantages. So you're going to be, whenever people are interacting with you, say shooting against you or trying to pull a fast one on your character, your opponents are going to be getting a disadvantage on their rolls that you're imposing on them. It's not supernatural. It just represents the aura that you have and the talents that you bring to the table, as well, of course, items. There are a lot of gadgets that go along with spies. There's going to be a lot of those, and languages. And then finally, from a defect point of view, we don't usually get a lot of defects that we're building in to our classes, but obligated is certainly a defect that we're always saying that most spies are obligated to an organization that they work for, and so that's part of the class build, and that actually returns some points to you to spend towards other aspects of your character.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, for those who want to lean into more of the Bond type of affairs, it does look like you've got some representation for the crazy ass gadgets that you'd see.
Absolutely. I mean, with the item attribute that we have, the item attribute is taking points almost in a subcategory or a container attribute to then buy different things. So you want to have a really great gun that does some extra knockout, or maybe it shoots electricity, then you can put your points into the weapon attribute to enhance your particular equipment. Again, it doesn't have to be paranormal. You're just representing what your character is going to be able to do. And we know that some spy gadgets can certainly, in fiction, border on the supernatural in terms of what it does. It's like a pen that you click it and a bunch of gas pops out and suddenly everyone in the room gets knocked out. Well, that's not typically how gas works, coming out of a little pen. But hey, it's great for fiction, and that's what role playing is. It's about great fiction, and so we make sure that lots of gear that go towards the spy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can certainly get that. Now, with that kind of thing in mind, when it comes to the worlds that you've got, I do remember. This was with Besem, both the universe, and this was something that I kind of saw an early form of in 3. You had a whole set of rules regarding crossing universes. Do you plan on having something similar for Anime 5e, of some sort of in-universe setup for crossing between dimensions or the like?
So it's not specifically set up as a multi-dimension hopping. That's not what Beyonder Worlds. Beyonder Worlds presents the different types of genres beyond fantasy, and the rationale you'd have them between them is quite simple. If you were to go back to the Anime 5e core rules, you can get the ability to go between dimensions. I mean, it's a standard. You can either do it as a spell, right, like it's some sort of dimension walk type spell, or you can bring up dimensional portals as an attribute. And so these types of more, let's just say, more fantasy, more magical ways of moving between dimensions. From the core rules, it's right there. You can bring in, if you want to have your characters jumping between modern day Earth into a mech fantasy world, into an urban fantasy world, and maybe even into traditional fantasy, like a D&D. You're going to suddenly end up in Waterdeep. No problem. There's easy ways to represent that. But the focus of this book was not to encourage that multi-universal system the way we have with Bessem. The Bessem multiverse that we have set up is specific about, these worlds are all connected and there's a geopolitical network between all these different worlds. That's not kind of what we did here, other than present the overarching idea that we have was, yes, Volstavia got infiltrated by Nox, and so the Volstavia setting, the official Enemy 5e setting, was kind of cut off by the powers that be and put into a little pocket world. But then there's a lot of other worlds that are, and all of these different setting that we have could be part of the worlds that are, and they could be as integrated and interconnected as you want them to be, or completely isolated. We're not encouraging a particular way of playing. We're just setting out the way we see the whole thing there, if you want to interconnect them. But in the end, it's up to an individual group what they want to do.
Essentially, you're giving people the blue bucket of Legos. That's really how philosophy has been in almost every game that I've done. Excluding, of course, the licensed products in the past, which were very specific for that license. But you giving the tools to the players so that they can do what they want to do, rather than saying, "This is what you're going to play. This is our vision, and we want you to play our vision." To give them the tools to create their own vision, and I think that is very powerful of what you can do. And Anime 5e is obviously more restrictive than Bessem. It's intended to be that way. It is intended to be a 5th edition game, and the people that are interested in Anime 5e are typically going to be D&D or 5th edition players, and that's fine. That's what we're giving the focus to, that where Bessem is intended to be more open. But at the same time, we're not going to tell people what type of fantasy they're going to run. We're not going to say it's going to be high fantasy or low fantasy or urban or mecha fantasy. We're going to give a bunch of tools and say, here's a smorgasbord at a buffet of ideas, and we're going to give you the tools that you can use and pick and choose which one you want. And we think that that's a great philosophy to bring out the best in role-playing groups. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the attributes that's going to be in this book is alternate form, and in fact, there's a lot of ones that are going to be familiar to people coming in from Bessem. I know I asked this before during the first time I interviewed about Anime 5e, but with this particular book, with Beyonder Worlds, were there any attributes or defects that were a little bit trickier to bring in one-to-one, or were they all relatively easy to bring in?
Well, when we were doing Anime 5e the first time, and we had to look and say, okay, what is going to be in Anime 5e? Given that we've done Bessem, and we know the multi-universal role-playing game for anime, but let's make a D&D one. Spells were really powerful, and alternate form, while it could have been in Anime 5e in the base, we didn't think it really belonged, because there were appropriate spells that did that with the polymorph, animal shapes, alter self, reduce, enlarge, reduce, that there's already spells that did that. So we didn't really think it was necessary to bring alternate form in, to still give people the ability in Anime 5e through spells to bring in changes to their body. But with the science fiction, well, we're bringing in, and say urban fantasy being great. Well, maybe that's not magic oriented, and we wanted to bring in something that is less magic and more integrated with a point-based extrapolation of what we did in Anime 5e. That's why alternate forms seem to make sense. So you spend 4 points to get 1 rank of alternate form. That gives you 5 points that you can then spend on alternate form's abilities. So you're saving a little bit of money, but that's because it's not your base form, it's an alternate form. So rather than saying, well, I'm going to spend 4 points to have this particular aspect of my character, instead, I'm going to get 5 points to do that, but I'm only going to have this sometimes because it's an alternate form. And we think that really played out well. Just as an example, it's not the only one. When we go through all of the attributes that we're bringing into Beyonder Worlds, it kind of closes the gap, or closes the spread between Anime 5e and Bessem, in terms of, well, there were aspects that we didn't bring over from a universal aspect of our anime role-playing game into Anime 5e, because we didn't think it belonged, based on A, it's fantasy, and B, there was a bunch of spells that could represent all that. but this closes the gap greatly, and now Bessem and Anime 5e with the Beyonder Worlds are now much more comparable in terms of what they can do. And there wasn't a lot of challenges, in terms of, you mentioned, as there are difficult things bringing over. There was a few things that operated differently, just in terms of either the math of a D20 die versus a 2D6 die, or something that plays out a little bit differently in terms of the effects of how combat work, like with multiple characters or with radiuses of spells. Because we didn't want to have something that was completely unbalanced to D&D, of course. And so we did have to look and say, well, what is the best way to handle this? And in the end, I think this is where I excel as a game designer, is looking and taking a balanced approach to different abilities and integrating it with the genre that you're trying to emulate.
Mm-hmm. And with that in mind, since one of the other pillars of this campaign is going to be Monstrum Libri Volume 2, I should ask if the new attributes and defects that are in Beyonder Worlds will also be reflected with some of the monster entries in Monstrum Libri.
Yeah, so when we did Monster Libri Volume 1, there were a few new elements that we thought were important for us to bring in to really represent the monsters that we wanted to have in the woodlands and mountain areas. And so when we were like, okay, so we brought in some extra combat techniques. We brought in the concept of a primal dynamic power. So, something super powerful, but if you have a dynamic powers over hell, for example, well, that's like really large as a scope. And so we brought in a few aspects, the swarm ability of an animal to be able to turn into a swarm. And that was in Monster Libri Volume 1. When we got to Volume 2 and we're focusing on the aquatic and desertic animals, it seemed like there were different ones that we wanted to bring in. So, summoning animals is something that we like, let's bring in summoning animals. Let's have a metamorphosis aspect. So now you're going to be changing the species of another an opponent. And so we brought in a few more elements into Monster Libri. And then, of course, with Beyonder Worlds, we're bringing in all of those elements. So yes, there is some repetition, but we don't have one book is assuming that you own another one. So the reason why Metamorphosis will appear in Monster Libri Volume 2 as well as Beyonder Worlds is because we don't assume you have both books. They are both kind of parallel in their development. And so there's a little bit of overlap, but that works fine. It's certainly better than telling someone to go buy a $40 book to get one ability.
Mm-hmm. And with that in mind, what are you shooting for as far as a page count for Beyonder Worlds?
So Beyonder Worlds is finished in terms, like when we do Kickstarters, typically our products are done, and that's one of the things we like doing. We don't, it's not always that way, but this one it is, and so it's clocks in at 160 pages. It's pretty dense in terms of what's in there. We got the page count down. It's it's a smaller font size in the Anime 5e line compared to some of the other lines that we have. So it's 160 pages, whereas Monster and Libby is 144, and yeah, they're just jam packed with information.
Mm-hmm. And as far as a release window, not a date per se, but a ballpark, what would you be shooting for?
So, as we mentioned in the campaign, that the 3 expansions from the digital copies, the PDFs, are going to be sent out just a couple weeks after the Kickstarter ends. There's time that Kickstarter has to process all the orders, and then we have to send out the backer surveys. So, because the products are done, we send out our digital copies pretty quickly. That'll be in August or September, depending on the exact timeline that happens. And then with the products being sent off to press pretty well immediately, we're just talking with the printers now, given that the files are ready to go, that we're aiming for a December window, which would be enough time to print them, ship them across the ocean, get them to our warehouse, and send them out. And we think that December is a good time. Sometimes we're a little bit early, as we were with the previous Kickstarter that you had mentioned about Bessem 2, the retro edition. We actually shipped that 2 months early, ahead of schedule. So it's great if we can be early, but if we're going to be late, it's usually a month or 2 slippage. We know that things around Christmas time in particular can be difficult, but December we think is a pretty accurate window for these 3 new products.
Mm-hmm. And I will certainly be looking forward to seeing how it develops. But with that said, I do want to sincerely thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come all the way to my temple and enjoy the madness that happens around here.
No, my pleasure. It's always great to be here and talking about the great stuff we're doing.
And anytime you see fit to return, the door is always open. As I often say around here, drinking is not mandatory, but it is encouraged. And, of course, a sincere thanks goes out to everyone who took the time out of their schedule to come onto the show and enjoy the madness. And there will be plenty more where that came from, as there always is here, on the open bar of the internet. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra. I am your gaming monk. Stay fucking frosty, everybody.